My name is Will Morgan. I'm Executive Director of the MPSA, and I'm here to introduce to you the Empire Lecture Series, as well as Skip Lupia, who'll be giving the first talk. I've known Skip for many years, actually. For the last few years, he's been President-elect, President, and now immediate past President of the MPSA. And he deals well with issues like this. Just to give you one example, Skip and I both were on the board of the Council of Social Science Associations, and Skip is a great contributor and supporter to the social science community. He even flew out for a meeting that COSA was having with the express purpose of, and we needed to have quorum of the board, and one of the key issues was voting half the board members off. It was too big. And Skip dutifully flew out, and we had exactly the right number of people for it. So he's always willing to help out. Lupia is regularly asked to advise scientific organizations and research groups on how to effectively communicate science in a politicized context. He currently serves as an executive member of the Board of Directors of Climate Central and on the advisory board of the National Academy's Division of Behavioral and Social Science and Education. He is immediate past president of the MPSA and past chair of the Division of Social, Economic, and Political Sciences at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. His topic today is responding to ignorance, why people appear to know so little about politics and what we can do about it. Please join me in welcoming Skip Lupia.
Thank you. Thanks, and welcome to this year's meeting of the Midwest Political Science Association. Thanks to Will Morgan. Will does a great job with the organization, and so many of the things that happen here are a direct result of his efforts. What I want to talk about today is us. People don't come to a political science meeting at random. A lot of us are motivated by a desire to help people understand politics and policy and government. And some of what drives the desire for many of us is the idea that people don't care a lot about politics, or more seriously, that they don't know things. So when we run surveys and ask questions like, what party has a majority in the US House of Representatives, there are typically a lot of Americans who don't know the answer. Or if we say, how many members are there in the US Supreme Court? Again, a lot of people don't know the answer. Or if we ask, who is the current Chief Justice? A lot of people don't know the answer. And so that leads to some questions, both about the health of our democracy. Is it okay or is it bad that people don't know these things? And so that's a conversation I want to have today. But I want to do more than just talk about that. I want to talk about what we could do about that. And so that's the idea of the talk today, responding to ignorance. So we didn't know if we were going to have a puppet show today, and we'll see if we do. I can go with or without. Are we good? Okay, the power switch. I don't see a power switch. Just let it. All right. That's right. So we'll continue without it. So the basic idea is that people lack information. And one of the concerns we have is that people who lack information can make bad decisions. So the question, here we go. So the question is, how should we respond to that? And so let me show you some responses. One common type of response is to identify the types of people who don't know things and to make recommendations about what they should do. All right. For example, in the weeks before the 2012 election, a story was done on what voters thought of one another. So Tom Edsall went to Pennsylvania and interviewed a gentleman named Kevin Balzer, truck driver. And he was asked why he thought Pennsylvania was going to Obama. Because remember, Pennsylvania was tight for a while, but towards the end it was leaning to Obama. And Mr. Balzer had an explanation. He said, well, people are stupid. Right? The reason that my state's going to Obama is because our people don't know about history, and they don't know about government, and they don't know about the Constitution. Right? That's why Obama's winning in my state. So that's a common narrative. That's a common, there's an outcome I don't like, and I know why it's happening, because there are these other people who are ignorant of important facts. But it's not just people on the street. So this is Gary Ackerman, and he served in Congress for 29 years, a Democrat from New York. His exit interview in Business Week, asking kind of what had changed in his years in Congress. He was asked, what about the decline in congressional cooperation? What are the types of factors that have led to that? Because we've seen we've seen the divisiveness, right? We've seen the polarization, and he had an explanation. He's like, well, society has changed, and the public's to blame as well. I think the people have gotten dumber, and they don't hold us accountable. Right? So these are arguments that we're familiar with. They come from people on the street, they come from elites. And so, but I want the question to return to us, which is, what should we do about that? What should we do? Now, some people have suggestions about what we should do with ignorant citizens. And so here's a common one. Okay, so this is LZ Granderson, and he's a columnist for CNN and ESPN. He's worked for other organizations. And he did a column on voter ignorance, right, and talked about how terrible it is about that things, people don't know various things. And he had a proposal. And the proposal is, let's weed out some of the ignorant people by making those who want to vote first pass a test. So this is a common idea, too. So let's have people pass a test. And so this is where things get really interesting, and this is where we come in. Let's take this idea seriously, that there's a minimum amount of information that people should have to vote and have opinions and so forth. What would we put on this test? What would we put on this test? Is there a consensus? You know? No, there is not a consensus. A lot of people will give you very strongly felt advice about the things that people should know. But I've looked at many of these lists. I'm not sure I've looked at all of them because people are producing them every day. But I can tell you that the intersection of all these lists, if we take all the lists of claims that even major organizations have said, here's what the public should know about politics, and say, okay, well, what is the set of questions that's on all the lists? It's the empty set. There's a basic disagreement about this. But let's think about something more constructive. Let's just think about ourselves and our position as educators. What is it that we know, and what might be a good starting place for us? So I decided to give myself a test as I thought about this. And so I thought about, well, I'm seen as an expert on this topic. And how many laws per year are passed by the US Congress? Like, that's something like I should know. But I didn't really know. Turns out that on average from 2001 to 2010, Congress passed about 200 laws per year. Name some. Okay, well that's a little harder, right? We can all name the Affordable Care Act and things like that, but that's interesting as we start to think about what is it that we know that they don't know. Right? I thought about my state. I live in the state of Michigan. How many laws per year does the state of Michigan pass? All right? Well, that number, in 2011, the state of Michigan passed 323 laws. Interesting. How many of those can I name? Not very many. But it's more than laws, because when a law is written, a lot of times laws are vague. Laws are statement of principle, but you actually have to tell the people in government and bureaucratic agencies what to do. And so after a law is written, typically rules have to be written. So in the federal level, rules are written and they're put in the Federal Register. So we take a law, give it to a bureaucracy, they write out specific rules about how the law is going to be implemented, and those are the directions that people take when they're acting in the name of government. Okay, well, how many of these rules are promulgated in any given year? All right? In 2011, the federal government promulgated over 3,500 distinct rules. Now, what did these rules have in them? I don't know. But I will tell you this, they're all published in the Federal Register. And I'll tell you, if you've never seen the Federal Register before, it's like there's a paper version, it's about 8.5 by 11, has 2 columns, single-spaced, I'd say 6 to 8 point font. It's like the fine print on any electronics that you buy. Right? So how many pages of the Federal Register would 1 year of rules take up? Well, in 2001, they took more than 82,000 pages of the Federal Register. Why should we, now you might ask, why should you care about this? Well, I'll tell you one more thing about these rules. Every single one has the full force of law. Every single one is binding on all of us. So where does that leave us when we think about responding to ignorance? So what I want to tell you now is about 2 groups of people. Right? There's 2 groups of people, and part of responding effectively is understanding the difference between these 2 groups. So one group of people recognizes that they're almost completely ignorant of almost every aspect of political life. And the other group is delusional about how much they know. There's no third group. Okay? So as we start to think about these problems caused by ignorant and ignorant voters and what we put on a test and so forth, the question becomes, how should we respond? But now I want to give a more, I want to restate the question more precisely. So let's not just talk about it, let's think about doing something about it. So we're all educators, right? Or we aspire to be educators. So how should we respond? And, if you're a professor or, if you're an expert or a teacher, if you're an advocate, right, or you're a scientist, everybody is, a lot of people are trying to teach other people about politics and government, are trying to respond to ignorance, right? Educators, we produce lots of things. We produce lots of information. But a question I would ask is, does any of it make a difference? We want it to make a difference. We'd like to tell ourselves it makes a difference. We'd like to tell ourselves that all of these things we do actually improve political knowledge, actually improve civic competence, right? But here's the key question. If we're saying, how should we respond, right, the real question for us as educators should be, what type of information is most valuable to give to people, all right? So, because attention is short, I'm now going to tell you the answer to this question, and this is the 20-second version of the rest of the talk. If you have somewhere else to go, 25 seconds from now would be a fine time to go, or you can hear the longer version of the story. A problem with a lot of us in civic education is we don't really ask ourselves this question. We ask ourselves the question, what information is important to us? What information has been important to our peer group? But another question we might ask is, what effect does this information have if we give it to someone who isn't like us? If we give it to someone who doesn't know the same things as us? So here's the 25-second version. If we're going to think about the value of information and what information we would convey to respond to ignorance most effectively and constructively, we'd want to think about something called the sweet spot. And that is the type of information that has two qualities. One quality is that it attracts needed attention. Right? If you're going to teach me something, a necessary condition for me to learn from it is that I am willing to pay attention to it. We don't think about that. Sometimes we just assume, well, because I'm right, people should pay attention. As I'm going to show you, biology doesn't work that way. Right? And so even if you have factually correct information, if it's not in a form that would draw people's attention, we're Charlie Brown's mother. Right? And that's not a great place to be if you want to give people information of value. These were supposed to be circles. I'm not sure what happened to the translation here. But the other thing it has to do is improve task performance. Turns out there's an infinite amount of information about politics available, all the policies we could talk about, all the perspectives we could take. So if we want to provide information of value, the question is, what is our audience going to do with it? The President of the United States gets a security briefing every morning. It has information that is pertinent to decisions that he has to make. Now, if we got the security, if security was violated, or and we got this on our desk, how valuable would that information be to us? Besides the reselling it on eBay or to Snowden or whatever, how valuable would that be to us? And yet, there are a lot of things that we are the people that we try to teach on a daily basis. We have things that they try to do, ways that they try to improve their community, ways that they try to influence politics. How valuable is the information that we give to them? Right? So the sweet spot is information that gets their attention, and that also, if they were to pay attention to it, helps them do something of value. And this turns out to be a little harder than it sounds. What I want to talk about now is what types of information have that ability, have that property. So let's talk about attention. Okay? So attention is going to be the real bottleneck. If you're a university professor, sometimes you are immune from the social pressure of attention, by which I mean we set up classrooms and we set up incentives like grades where people are a captive audience, and they're forced to listen to us, no matter how bad our lectures are, no matter how coherent our message is. They have to they have to sit there and take the exam. But most of the time when we're talking to people, those aren't the actual rules, right? Attention works in a very different way, right? So what do we know about attention? The first thing we know is it's very limited. It's extraordinarily limited. If you, for example, tried to look at the ceiling here and think about, when was that made and how long did it take to make that? And did someone carve it or was it made from a machine? It's actually difficult to even hear what I'm saying, right? If you pay enough attention to something else, because our capacity to pay attention is extraordinarily limited. Moreover, when we direct our attention to one object, other parts of our system actively block out other things. So for example, if you're watching television and you're really into a program and your spouse or your friend comes in and talks to you, initially you can't hear them. It's not that your ears have stopped working, it's that the attention, part of the attentional mechanism that you're paying to the television is helping block out everything else, at least temporarily. Okay, so that's what we're dealing with. right? You might think, oh no, that's a character flaw. When we discuss important things, people should pay attention to us. As I'm going to show you now, that's really not in the cards for any of us. So where does our attention system come from? What we like to think is that when we show people information, they absorb it en masse, right? And that's the end of the story. But what's more interesting in terms of being effective is the beginning of the story. And so I like to begin the story with where our attention systems really came from. And they came from people like us having to deal with circumstances like this. So we're in the forest, we're in the fauna, we're in the jungle, right? That most of our brain development happens, when we're in this era, not in nice hotels. And so what are we really good at paying attention to? Well, certain details of this type of thing. So we can hone in on details of objects. We can tell differences between light and dark. We really like movement. Like if somebody moves something like that, it's hard not to pay attention to it. We also really like the smell of food, right? If you're having a conversation and food kind of comes in behind you, it's hard to pay attention to the words because after all, there's food, right? And so these are, again, these are the ground rules. So when we start to think about educating people, we're dealing with a brain structure that wasn't really developed for the type of high-end conversation that we have today, right? Our attention system was really built to deal with that, to deal with the environment, to deal with sort of our immediate needs, to sensitize us to danger, to sort of alert us to the presence of something we might want to eat, right? That's where it came from. And so one of the difficulties we have when trying to communicate about politics, trying to educate people about politics, is our brains were built for that. But now we started to introduce other things that could occupy people's attention. At first it was devices like this. So you could have a teletype, right? And with a teletype you could have this was, just for those of you who are young, this is the early Twitter. Right? So this is, one line of text, a few words at a time, very, very slow. So this we could handle. We could send each other messages. We'd have to figure out how to put things in a way. But when this machine came out, we were so happy to get information from a long way away. Even if it was just a few words, 140 characters, like, who would think that I could ever do this? So this was fantastic. Right? And then we started inventing more devices. So we invented this thing. And instead of just sending out single ribbons of text, we could make pages of text. And we could print them and we could put them in the mail or on a pony and we could send them one another. Well, that was fine because it was still really novel. And how many times would you get one of these? Right? And so that was fine. But an issue is this didn't change. This mechanism for starting to deal with this information is the same one that we had in the forest. Okay, but so far, no problem. But then we invent this. Right, now we have a telephone. And so now we can have real-time voice communications with someone. And okay, so now it's like a conversation, but I can't see you. All right, now I have to pay more attention. But we can start to send more information. And then we invent this, motion pictures and television. Right? And so the interesting thing now is we can have long-form narratives. We can start to send people images that are kind of too much to handle. I mean, if you're in a movie theater now and you have the modern CGI and everything's flying around you, it can be hard to focus on any element of what's going on. Certainly it's hard to talk to the person next to you. Now, I show Snow White for two reasons. One is because when it came out, it was a technical marvel, and people thought, what an amazing way to communicate. What an amazing way to tell a story. Animation, color, sound, and things like that. I liked the movie. But I'll tell you something about it. It came out, it was a marvel. I say this hesitantly. If you try to watch it today, it's almost unwatchable. There are 2 or 3 nice musical numbers, and the rest of it is really slow. Okay? Why does that matter? Because given the communicative capacity and expectation people had in the 1930s, this was amazing. But now you can barely watch it because our brains kind of stayed the same, but the communicative environment changed. Things got more complicated. We got more options. And so strategies that worked well at one time stop looking so good now. And what I want to suggest is for a lot of us in civic education, we have to ask which side of the Snow White curve we're on. Right? Are we talking about civic education, civic competence? Are we giving information in ways that were really exciting at one point now and can't get the attention of our students today? And if so, who needs to change? Short answer, us. All right? But the world has changed. So we're stuck with this, but now we're competing with lots of things. A key thing in thinking about how to communicate effectively, how to teach people important lessons, is the communicative space is becoming increasingly competitive, right? Now people just can't communicate with folks in their house. They can go onto the internet, right, and have live video, or they can have conversations or text with people around the world, right? There are billions of websites, and every time you put something online, the other ones don't shut down. They're still there. And so if you want someone to read what you're doing, they actually have to decide to stop watching YouTube, or stop looking at CNN, or stop watching ESPN. That competition is always there. And we might say our information is more important, so people should take the time to look at us. The thing I want to say is, except in a few artificial environments that we create at universities where we make people pay attention to us, in general, that's not how biology works. Biology leads people to pay attention to things that can keep them safe, right? We like to look for danger. We like things like food. We love immediate gratification, right? Those are not character flaws, or you can think of them that way, but they're biological realities. So anytime that we, those of you who work at universities now, you're competing with these all of the time, right? Unless you don't allow them in your classroom, which is called cheating. But the point is, we're always competing. Right, we're always competing. Now, I will say, you might say, yeah, technology has really made teaching a lot harder. I'd say it's made it a little harder. It's always been the case that our students, if you're a professor, they could always think about other things, and chances are they were. We just couldn't see them doing it on a screen. Moreover, we have these social cues that we give, like if you're talking to someone and you're not really listening to them, you're sort of thinking about what you're thinking about, and then they stop talking and you go, oh yeah, sure. Right? We're cued to make it as if we're listening. We present ourselves as if. So now, when I walk around a classroom or a seminar room and I see somebody on a laptop not looking at the content of the course, I see that as a window to your soul. I see that as what's always been happening, and that's, if we want to be effective communicators and teachers, that's our reality, right? So how do we go from this communicated environment to not being Charlie Brown's mother? Okay, so now I want to give you some constructive facts about brains and some things that we might be able to use. So A, our brains are still the same as they were 1,000, 5,000 years ago. All right, so that we don't get to change that, at least not yet. So here's the thing to know. When people talk about the capacity of perception, a common number thrown around is 7 plus or minus 2. It's due to some studies from Miller in the 1950s. Had to do with reading comprehension. But a way to think about this currency is, how many things can you think about without thinking about them? So if I say, I'm thinking about a wagon, an image might come to your mind without any effort at all. Right? I say, well, actually, I'm thinking about a covered wagon from the Old West, about 1890s, with like a ripped awning and things of that nature, and 5 horses. Right? When I describe that, if that wasn't in your mind right away, you had to take time to construct it. So if you had to think about a horse and what a rip would mean and what the 1890s would be and so forth, if you had to think about them separately, it would have been difficult for you not only to pay attention to anything else, but the things I was saying right after I introduced that image. Whereas if the initial image you had was that wagon, you're clear, you could follow the rest of the conversation. 7 plus, so if you're an expert in an area, we think about chess. The difference between an expert and a novice in chess isn't the number of chunks they bring to the table, it's the information in a chunk. An expert can walk to the table and they can see their first 6 moves. They can just see what's going to happen. A novice can come up and say, oh, a horse, right? And that's sort of, to build a strategy, they'd have to think about other things, right? So this part of our perception doesn't change. The plus or minus 2 has to do with adrenaline, okay? So, in sports, people say sometimes the net is really big, the world slows down. That's when you're at 7 plus 2. That's when the attentional channel is as open as it's going to be, and you can see everything and the world slows down. The wrong side, I've done both of these. If you've been in a car accident and everything slows down, same thing, your attention channel's going, whoop, right? What's going on here, right? But then 7 minus 2 is when you're in your living room at night, you've had a hard day at work, and you can barely find the remote. Like you can't even find the buttons, right? It's the same brain, but your motivation, your adrenaline is just down, so your attentional channel is as small as it's going to be. This never changes. This aspect of cognition never changes. The number of things we can think about simultaneously never goes up to 20. It's always in this neighborhood. Here's another couple things, which are going to seem like they're bad, but they're the building blocks for an effective strategy. So here's one thing. We are easily distracted. Okay? Right? How hard was that? all right? We're easily distracted. And it's not just now, it's all the time. If a roast beef sandwich were to walk into the back of the room, your heads would turn, except for vegetarians, and I'm not sure what you would do. But we can't help it, right? And this is constant. A second thing is we really love quick and simple explanations of things. We love them, even as scientists. All right? So I work a lot with climate scientists and how to communicate things. And one organization I work with, we have a saying internally, which is, our job is to keep the right from lying and the left from exaggerating. Okay? So the idea is you put out facts about science, and then one side says, oh, this is all awful, and the other says, no, it's all absolute truth. We haven't read it, but we know. Right? And so we love quick and simple explanations. If we can find a single factor explanation for something complicated, makes us feel good, gets us out of the conversation, keeps us from hurting ourselves, we're on it. We love these, okay? This is not changeable. The final thing is, we often evaluate information not based on its true content, but on how it makes us feel. Right? So many of you might have a partisan affiliation. You might be really interested if you're in American politics. You might be on the left, you might be on the right. So suppose you're on the left and someone forces you to watch Fox News. Or you're on the right and someone forces you to watch MSNBC. The typical experience isn't there, oh, I'm going to be really open-minded about this broadcast and really think through the thesis that they're delivering. The typical reaction is, ew, ew. Right? This person's awful. Instead of thinking about their argument, I'm going to make up an internal narrative about how awful this person is, because we're trying to distance ourselves from the stimuli. It's like being in the woods and running into a dead animal, and it's like, you're trying to get away from it. We do that with information. And if somebody says something to us that confirms our previous beliefs and sort of boosts our identity, we love that. And we won't give you the second degree about whether it's true. You're all right. You agree with me, right? So this is, again, these aren't, you can say they're personality flaws, but the bigger thing to understand about them is these attributes of our nature are not the exception. They're the rule. They're the rule when we talk about Congress. They're the rule when we talk about voting. They're the rule when we talk about international relations. They're the rule, right? And so, if we start to tell stories that are relevant to us, but threatening to them, or relevant to us, but not crucial to the internal narrative that they walked in the room with, the things that they were concerned about, we become Charlie Brown's mom pretty quickly. And our well-formed theses, they look incomprehensible. So that's the world we live in. We're competing with so many forces for information when people are in front of the internet or when they're not. If we want to give people effective information about politics, the thing to understand is this is where we are, right? These attributes of information are not the exception. They're the rule, right? The people who do these things, we could talk about their morality, but the one thing we can say is they're completely consistent with their biology, right? So what do we do? What do we do? So I want to give you a couple ideas. This is I'm summarizing a research agenda. Obviously, I'm happy to give you some more specific examples. But let's just talk about how to get attention. Because if we're going to teach anybody anything, we have to get attention. We have to somehow break through this bottleneck. Okay. So the first thing is immediate relevance to core concerns. As I like to say to people, teaching, persuasion, it's an away game. Not a home game, in the sense that you might be the world's expert in an area, but if you're going to teach somebody something, almost all of the interesting things that happens are between the ears of your listener. They have to decide to pay attention to it and block out the other things that they could look at. They have to decide to take what you're talking about and somehow break it apart, sort of think about what it might mean, and then tie it into the set of beliefs and feelings that they already have, right? We can put images in front of people, but you can't really make people learn. They have to decide to do that on their own. We can set up grading systems that motivate people, but ultimately, if you set up a grading system and a person looks the other way while you're speaking, they can't hear you, right? So immediate relevance to core concerns. This isn't a plea for kind of talking about applied research rather than basic. Nothing like it. It's, I know that people walk into a room and they have a set of concerns. And I don't know what they all are, but in a room like this or in any room that I walk into, I have a sense of it. And if I don't have a sense of it, I try to learn about it. And then the question is, how can I find the intersection between the content I'm trying to convey and the core concerns that these people walk into the room with. Because here's the thing I know. Whatever you were thinking about when you came in, right, maybe for a couple minutes I can distract you by throwing pens or showing you pictures. But when you leave that room, gradually you're going to go back to the internal narrative and the core concerns that you walked in with. We all do this. There's a set of things that define us. So if we want to teach people things that they're going to think about, the question is, how close can we get to those core concerns? Because the way that the attentional channel opens us is for us to get close to that, and for people to want our information, not because we think it's good, but because they think it helps us, it helps them achieve their aspirations. Another thing is consistent with values, okay? In politics, we sometimes deal with value diversity. That's the nice way of saying divisiveness or polarization or whatever, but it's there. Now, if you only want to talk to people in your tent, that's fine. Then you know what to say, you know what the code words are and the cultural references and things of that nature. But if you ever want to expand the tent, right, then the question is, how can you be true to what you're trying to say and yet present it in a way that is commensurate with different value orientations in the room? Right? Can you find, even if you have Democrats and Republicans in the room, can you find a commonality, like a concern for education, or a concern for children, or a concern for a certain group that might seem vulnerable? Is there something, at least if you want to start the conversation, that unifies people? Because the one thing we know about information is if you appear to be threatening, right, then even though you think your intentions are good, they think you're Bill O'Reilly or Rachel Maddow, whichever one you happen not to like. Right? And when that happens, they stop paying attention. Right? Actionable. We really like things where we can imagine how we could use the information to improve our lives. Right? Now, this may seem like, well, that's pretty obvious, but I would say that it isn't. Again, I mentioned I work with climate scientists a lot. I can talk about the politics things too. And a lot of climate scientists are lovely people. But sometimes what they want to do is tell you the global story of climate, how it works and things of that nature. And there are some people who are really interested in that story. But there are more people who really aren't. What they want to know is ultimately, are you going to get to some point that affects something I can do? Like, what do I do with this information? Do I run because the world's going to change and I can't affect it? Right? Or are you talking to me because you want me to do something? If somehow I can link my content to something you can do, the attention channel tends to open. People start to think about it a little more, imagine themselves taking the action, and then maybe they want to learn more about what you know. This is, in some way, this is saying something that we should already know, because we know when we're too abstract, like we lose our audience. But again, this isn't a claim about what one should do. This is a claim about what biology lets us do. Right? Biology is really unforgiving in the attention department. Right? Finally, cost effective. We might think that, sometimes I have to give you a detailed explanation. I might want to give you a detailed explanation, and there's nothing wrong with that. But for you to be interested in a detailed explanation, you have to have what a person needs to know is what's in it for them. And I know that sounds crude, but again, this is biology and it's about attention. So I like to talk about apps. If I want to engage you in a detailed conversation, the first thing I have to do is give you a couple apps. Describe some examples or some ideas about how you might achieve something you want. And if I gave you 2 or 3 of those, you might say, that's kind of interesting. I would sure like to know how to create some of those apps myself, how to do some of those things myself. How would I do that? And that's how people can become interested in having a detailed conversations. But sometimes if you hit somebody with details and abstractions up front, you're Charlie Brown's mom, you're threatening, they shut off, right? So I think of apps as the gateway drug of communication, right? Can I start with an iconic example that helps you? Oh, yeah, I really like thinking about that. And if I give you 2 or 3, you might say, I would sure love to be able to create iconic examples myself. I'm like, oh, here's a book, right? So what I'd like to do, this is an outline. I just want to show you one example in the interest of time, and then we'll take questions, okay? So I want to talk to you about maps. Just because everybody's familiar with maps. So sometimes people in science, people in politics, try to tell their story with maps. So here's a map. Well, look, there's a word. Right, now here's a map. I think it's coming up. So this is a map developed by a science organization. It's a map that is accurate with respect to a knowledge base, but it's a problematic map, okay? Because what the map is showing is deaths attributed to climate change. What are the problems with this map? If we run focus groups and ask what people look at, where do you think if people were given a map of the world that looks like this, where would you think their eyes go first? Where they live, where they live, Okay, so most of the intended audience for this map is in North America or in Western Europe. So what you're seeing here is there's some parts of the world that are green, and it means there aren't as many deaths. And then there are parts of the world that are red. But for the typical reader of this map, an initial reaction might be, oh, it's green where I live. What's the problem? Yeah, there's that place far away that's red, but I've never been there. I don't know, nobody lives there, right? So maybe it's not a problem. Now, one could take if what you're trying to do is say, you know, a set of actions causes deaths, right? And I want you to know this. One thing you could do and stay true to the knowledge base is make everything a different shade of red. Say it causes deaths everywhere, but in some places there are more than others. So then, particularly if we knew people's eyes were going to people's eyes were going to focus on North America or Western Europe first, they'd say, "Oh, it's not great where I live," and other places too. So that's a simple change, right? Here's another map. I just like this one. So the question is, what's that? Right? What's that? And the answer is, it depends on how old you are. For some people, it's a pie chart, and for other people, it's Pac-Man. Okay? Now, you might say, well, which one is it really? And that's, the question is, it's whatever your audience thinks it is. Right? It's whatever they think it is. So the key thing when you're trying to put an image in front of people, when you're trying to put an example in front of people, is how relevant is it to their lives? Like, how can you take the content of what you're trying to say and tell it in a way where they automatically see it? So I'm going to show you an example of a firm that an organization that I work with to try and do this, and I'll give you a before and after. So again, I mentioned I work with a lot of scientists, but climate is something we all know about. So here's a map of estimating changes in global temperatures over the next 100 years. Now, this map is problematic. It's factually accurate, but you can see the temperature scale here. Warming starts with the color purple and deep blue. It doesn't get to red until about +5 Celsius. So you see in Iowa there and Missouri and things like that, where it looks like an ice pond. That's meant to represent a warming. If you look at the grid, that's warming. But you look at the map, say, no, I want to skate on that, right? And so this is a visual that people can't relate to. Moreover, if you were trying to tell a story about climate change can affect your life, people can't see where they live. So I'm on the board of an organization called Climate Central. You can look them up. And they're a great group of people. They're nonpartisan, they're not policy. And the idea is they try to tell the story of climate change in a way that people can just get a sense of what it is and how it might affect them. So one of the projects, you can look it up, they did all the work on this, but I talked to them about it earlier, was surging seas. And so one of the effects of climate change is extreme weather. And one of the effects that extreme weather can have over time is changing sea levels. Right, that and melting ice caps and things like that. So I can talk about that and you say, yeah, that's a big abstract thing, melting ice caps, Antarctica, how does it affect me? But this organization built a bunch of models to try and show how different estimates about climate change would affect certain parts of the country. And so they asked me, how should we present this? And to make a long story short, I'm like, I don't think people care about a map like that. If you really want to tell the story, they want to know what's going to happen to my house, or where my kids go to school, or where I go to church, or Disneyland, right? What's going to happen to those places? And so the way that they built this out, and you can play with it if you want, is you can zoom in on your house, or your church, or your favorite store. So here's an example. I'll just show you how it zooms in. Right, so you can go here, and this is Miami. And if you live in Miami, you probably don't want to visit this site, because the news is not good because of the low land mass and the exposure. But here's Miami. And then what we can do is you say, well, I don't live in Miami, I live on a certain street. So we can zoom in, we can see your neighborhood. We can even get right down, this isn't even as far as you could zoom in, but you can start seeing, if the resolution were a little better, you could actually start seeing houses and buildings there. And then what we can do is there's a little slider here. And you can slide it based on the severity of different estimates of how climate change will work. So if you want to take very conservative estimates or very sort of, big estimates, you can do that. You can decide which model you want to use. But what you can see is the likely effect this has on your house. So what this blue area here represents is how likely it is that will your house be underwater or subject to certain types of floods or so forth. You can choose the type of thing you want to have happen to your neighborhood. The point is, the strategy here is to try and make something like this more relevant to people's narratives. I mean, it's not the only way to teach things. I know it's not in terms of civic education, but the point was we took a bunch of climate scientists here who are great people, and we used a lot of things from civic education and social science to say, here's a better way to tell your message. And the traffic that this site gets now is incredible. Whenever there's a big storm on the East Coast now, when Katrina or Sandy, or sorry, not Katrina, but Sandy or something like that, and the New York Times or like NBC News or something like that has maps where they show you the damage or the likely damage, they're probably getting it from this site, right? So again, this is a place where these strategies we're talking about how to improve, responding to ignorance, if you will, they really make a difference. So the last thing I want to say, or the last conclusion I want to give, did we lose that, is about us, right? Really, this talks about us. So, are people ignorant about politics? Yes. Welcome to the club. We all are. Does it matter? Yeah. Yeah. If we don't know certain things, we make bad decisions. Okay, great. So in our reactions we can make fun of them, we can castigate them, or we can tell them that they can't vote. But them or us, them are us, right? We're all ignorant about different things. And so the critical thing is if we want to give people information of value, what do we need to know about it? What information is most valuable to convey? What I've talked about here in the interest of time is trying to get information that can at least get their attention, because that's half the battle. If you have factually accurate information that would help people improve all their decisions, if they don't pay attention to it, it doesn't matter. So you've got to have that, and we need to pay more attention to that. And then the other is trying to think about what are the things that people do with information. I'm happy to answer questions about that. I have some research on it, but that's the other part of it. But the main lesson there is a common mistake that experts make is to think that things are essential for us to know are essential for somebody else to know. And if you look at that, if you look at these relationships pretty quickly, it falls apart very fast. If you ask me, like, what's the most important thing for a U.S. citizen to know, right? I'd say, what does 9/11, what does 911 mean? Dialing emergencies, right? If you think about the effect that you can have on your community. If you want to say, what's the most important fact about voting? When's election day and how is it that you can vote? I mean, these are necessary conditions for other things if you think the ballot box is essential. But you might say, no, but what about the history of the country and so forth? And I think those are important things too, but there's an infinite number of historical facts we could convey, and so a conversation becomes, which ones would have the greatest value for our audience, right? And A, we want people to pay attention to them, but B, we'd want to convey facts that help people, accomplish the task that we want. I can talk about what that is because that's an interesting conversation. So that's it. It's the sweet spot. And I think that if I had one critique of civic education as it exists today, is its intentions are fabulous, but it's too self-referential. We often, if we try to put together a quiz about like what people should know, we gather experts like ourselves. There are civic education, people who measure and promote civic education who are wonderful, and they bring together panels to decide what questions to ask of high school students or elementary school students or the public. But what you'll see is typically the experts are all their peers. So when it's high school, they'll bring together 60 high school teachers and they'll try and reach a consensus. And I love high school teachers. Right? But what high school teachers think is important to teach might not be the types of things you might say are critical for the social tasks that these students have to have. And it's no critique of high school students. It's just understanding that when we try to come up with answers about what we should teach people, it's often very self-referential. And biology is not very forgiving for that. So as we try to improve civic education, I think focusing on the audience is a critical thing to do. I have more to say about this later this year. There's a book with that title, and it will go through the whole story about the attention and what types of information is available for various tasks and so forth. But for right now, I will conclude and take any questions that you have. Thank you. This is a walk around for.
Just run around with that mic in the audience and we can hear the questions.
So if you have questions, great. If not, that's fine too.
Very good talk, Steve. It's not so much a question as a comment. Your description of how to reach people with new information struck me as very close to what I tell students politics is all about. Persuading people to do what you want them to do for their purposes, not for your purposes.
Yeah.
That's really what you're talking about.
I think it's the same. I think it's the same thing, and I think the people who are successful in politics figure that out, right? I mean, I love partisans, but the one that can't, for the life of them, figure out why someone would take the point of view and just keeps yelling at them, they never grow their tent. And the ones that are really successful, the transformative people who change their coalitions, are the ones that I think fundamentally get this point. It's also one of the areas, like civic education has a, it can be applied to economics, psychology, anthropology, all the topics. You guys, we in political science, I think, have a special ability to help civic education be successful for exactly the reason that Professor Jacobson pointed out. I mean, we live in the world of value diversity, right? And so that's always in the room. When that and attention limits are in the room at the same time, if we want to talk to anybody, we've got to talk to them on their terms. At least to start the conversation. Hi, what's your name?
Jacob Smith.
Hey, Jacob.
I really enjoyed the talk, and I was especially interested in this because I think I was sitting next to someone from the second group that you were talking about when I was on the flight to the conference today.
Yeah.
Someone who thought they knew everything. So someone who was engaged, and in fact was so engaged that they wanted to talk to me the entire flight. I enjoyed talking to them, sort of. But so what would you recommend for that sort of person? Sort of how would you modify this approach based on the sort of person who isn't necessarily interested or just is interested enough to vote and that's about it, versus the person who is really interested but maybe has some, misconceptions.
Yeah. So it depends on your objective. So, sometimes your objective is to expand the tent, right? There's a group of people who already believe A, there's a group of people who believe not A, and the question is, can you expand the group of people who believe A, right? If you want to do that, you have no choice but to try and understand and really be empathetic towards their value orientation, even if it's not yours. And then the question is, can you, while staying true to yourself, find a narrative, find a set of examples that they'll at least want to listen to, right? And that's the only way it can happen, right? It's establishing common ground. It's a way to build credibility, it's a way to build trust and things of that nature. Now, that's not everybody's objective. Sometimes you might say, no, I have a moral stance, and this person is objectionable, right? This person, there's nothing I can build, and then my advice there is, this would not be a good use of your time to talk to that person, right? When I talk about campaigns, when I think about people who are trying to do persuasion campaigns, I talk about three audiences, right? One are the people who are already on your side, and all they need to be is reinforced. One group is the people who are not on your side, and you have nothing in common with them, right? And then there's the middle. And so so a red flag for me is the person who comes in like, I want to talk to everybody. I'm like, you can love the people who disagree with you, but if you're trying to make the best use of your time, you really want to focus on people who could potentially have a conversation with you. And again, this is kind of the intersection between politics and communication. Yeah. Hi, what's your name?
Hi, I'm Rune Slotjus from Aarhus University, and thank you for a very interesting and certainly attention-grabbing talk. But I wanted to hear more about your second part, not only how to get the attention, but also how to convey information that helps people perform better on the tasks that they need to perform as good citizens. So like, how do they find out to vote for the right party, or how do they learn to support the best policies?
Okay, well, thank you for asking that question. Just because of the time, I didn't want to go through both. So the question you're asking is interesting, and I have an answer to it, but it might not be the one that you want. So let me use an analogy first. Sometimes, like, we could go to a doctor or a nutritionist, and the question might be, well, what should I eat? What should I eat? And so if we look at the current vanguard of sort of the science of nutrition and how it affects health, it turns out there's not a single answer to that. The answer depends on, well, do you have teeth? Because like babies don't have teeth, and some other people don't have teeth, and so there's a bunch of things that like you might want some people, and you don't want them to eat it, right? Do you have acid reflux disease? Do you have food allergies? Are you trying to run a marathon? Are you trying to gain weight? Are you trying to lose weight? And so the point is, there's some science we can use to tell those people what to eat, but there's not a universal answer. So what I'm setting up here is now we talk about what facts should people know. And I'd love to tell you that there's a universal answer, but sometimes it depends on, well, what do we need, what do we want people to do? And so in some societies, it's better if some people are police, and some people are lawyers, and some people run prisons, and some people run restaurants, and things of that nature. And so there's some common things we need for them to know to have a community, to build trust relationships, and so forth. but they don't all need to know the same things. So that would be that's kind of the overview, but I'll be more specific now. Information is valuable. I think about 4 dimensions that affect the value of information with respect to tasks. One is, how commensurate is the information with your values? And the reason that values matter here is not just because of attention, but issues aren't born political. They become political because there's some value diversity associated with it, right? Politics are problems that we kind of can't deal with just casually, so we try to build rules and institutions and things of that nature, right? Issues become political. And so if you and I are going to be able to do something new, do something of value to ourselves and our community, it has to be with respect to a value orientation. Here's an example just to make clear what I'm talking about. In the 19th century, child labor was a critical and divisive political issue in this country, right? It was one of the bigger issues. And why was that? Well, prior to people moving to the cities in the Industrial Revolution, the typical family economy was built around a farm. And in a farm economy, through most of the 19th centuries, perfectly natural to have kids work on the farm. I grew up on a farm. Kids work on a farm, not a big deal. But when people moved to the cities, right, the natural analogy was, well, I'll bring the kids to the factory too, right, because then they can help the family earn income. And so initially that made sense, but then people started thinking about, is it right to have 7-year-olds working in a steel, or not a steel mill, but sort of working in big industrial? And so there was a debate, and there was a huge value conflict, right? Today, if any politician suggested, well, the way we can grow the American economy is to have more 7-year-olds in our factories, right, they'd get laughed off the stage. The issue from a physical perspective is identical, but it's no longer political today because there's a value consensus around it. So part of the question of, like, what should we teach people is, what set of value orientations are we trying to pursue? Now, if we live in a community where there's a core set of common values, right, then you and I can start to build the answer, right? Because now we can say, okay, given this value orientation, what are the most important things for us to do? Given the most important things for us to do, what types of information are necessary or sufficient for our citizens to be able to do those things? And then we can start writing the manual, right? Then we can get to that point. So that's the answer to your question, and I think you can build great strategies around it. But the first part of the answer is, for the reason that you talked about, isn't always the one they want to hear. They're just like, no, wait a minute. Can we just start with the assumption that I'm right? And then tell everybody that they need to know what I know? And like, some people are in that circumstance, but most of us aren't. Are we done?
We've gone over, but there's no group that's following us, so maybe a question or 2 more.
As you wish. Hi, what's your name?
Hello, Frank Mannheim.
Hi, Frank.
The second point you made was that the information being distributed has to be relevant to core concerns
Yes, sir.
of society or whoever you're talking to. Last year, you and the APSA presented a really tough report about the perception of political science by society, or not political science, but the university as a whole. And at the same time, the NSF support for political science was canceled. Now, I did not see that those events got adequate attention by the political science community. And just recently, there's a hard-hitting article has come out in the National Academy journal, Issues in Science and Technology, by Michael Crow and the president of ASU and a cooperator, where they said that that higher education research and education establishment no longer aligns with the changing needs of American society. So this suggests that it's not enough to distribute your perception of things, but reevaluate what you're doing comprehensively. Isn't that, when you're in trouble, you may not be able to influence the other people as much as you can influence your own effectiveness. So I'm wondering what the APSA or other groups in your acquaintance are doing to give attention to this.
Thank you. All right, that's a wonderful question. So just as I don't know, as a disclaimer, so I've led the MPSA task force on public engagement, and I'm also head of the roundtable for the National Academies on the applicability of behavioral and social science. So I will answer the question from that perspective. Here's the overview. I think here's the bigger issue with respect to your question. Universities have had close to a 1,000-year monopoly on the production and distribution of certain types of information. And so if we gave bad presentations, or we didn't really talk to policymakers in a way they could understand, or we didn't talk in a way the press could understand, it didn't matter because they had to come to us. That's over, right? The internet has exploded that in the following way. Our knowledge still matters, right? Our knowledge can still have great public value, but now on the internet, lots of people can make knowledge claims that look a lot like ours, right? So that, so the monopoly is over. And so for us to remain relevant in the public sphere, we have to change our strategy. So I think what I've done to this point is maybe try to repeat your question or the premise of it. And so I'll tell you what people have done. In the National Academies, there's been a huge emphasis on communicating science more effectively and on stakeholder engagement, right? So here's an article I want to write in the next 6 months. A lot of scientists are frustrated with policymakers. They're like, they really don't understand what we do, and if only they understood what we do, they would listen to us. Here's the article I want to write. What policymakers don't understand about scientists, and what scientists don't understand about policymakers. And 90% of the article would actually be about the second part. Because we'll walk into a policymaker's office and start giving them information that they don't care about and they can't use, right? Here's the simple thing that I think. I think what we do in science is we're kind of experts on certain types of precision, measurement, ideas, and things of that nature. Politicians are experts too on trade-offs. Like the guys who win elective office, they're the best at articulating certain social trade-offs. So when a scientist goes into a legislator's office and says, I'm going to tell you what trade-offs you should make, they kind of can't hear that. Some of them recoil at it and like, why are we paying you guys to do this, right? So what the National Academy has done is really tried to train scientists to understand more about what different constituencies want from science. Not to kind of change what science is, but to change how we talk about it and produce it so it's of more value, because we pay a lot of money for science. I mean, the other part of it, one event that we did at the National Academy is we actually gave we did a day inside Congress. We actually were inside the building with congressional staffers. And so you might think, well, the strategy wasn't, let's tell you how great social science is, because who wants to go to that? So what we did was a full day on how scientific research can save the government money. And that's actually what we talked about. The whole day, how things in social science can save the government money. We didn't say, oh, you have to listen to us, or you're not paying enough, you're not being nice to us in public. We didn't talk about that at all. It's like, we're going to give you 20 different ways that it saved you money. And then if you're interested in more, here's our phone number, right? And that was the type of thing. We got, I think, 75 to 100 staffers to come to it. We got some great feedback as a result of it. So the way I'm trying to answer your question is I think for a long time we misunderstood how to talk to people because we had this monopoly and people had to come to us. I think what this change in communication the internet has done has made us realize that if we want to remain relevant in the public sphere, we've got to understand the people who we think we're serving, right? And we have to learn how to, communicate more effectively to them. If we don't do that, then we shouldn't be surprised when they say, what are you guys doing here? Why are we still paying you, right? I think we have to have a big internal change in how we orient ourselves towards people. I think that the National Academies and the American Political Science Association and this organization, by having events like this, I think they're working there. Between you and me, I'd like them to go faster, but they are moving, and I think your question is completely relevant.
Do you worry that by presenting information to people in individual terms, you reduce their ability to see collective solutions to what are ultimately systemic problems?
So that's a great question. Could everyone hear it? All right. I would worry about. I'll tell you. I worry about it at some level, but it's kind of a secondary concern. My primary concern is, first we have to talk. First I have to actually get your attention. So if that doesn't happen, if you're not willing to listen to me and I'm not listening to you, nothing else counts, right? So the first order kind of hurdle that we have to capture is opening the attentional channel and getting someone to listen. And so one of the things that biology does to us is it makes us really into ourselves. Like we can sort of be in a group and we can kind of be nice to other people, but our internal narrative and our kind of whether we like people or don't like people or like information or don't like information, it's really all about us, right? So that's a biology thing. When I talk to people about how to communicate with one another, I use this movie, this reference from a movie 15 years ago. It's like, she's really not that into you. I'm like, that has to be your key assumption. That if you and I are talking and I'm not telling the story of you in a way that you recognize, this conversation might not be that interesting. So I have to get through that. But now the question is, when that bottleneck opens, what do we talk about? And I think there what I can do, one of the things I get to do is say, there's a lot of people like you. Or there's a lot of people who are in a situation that you have been in. Or there's a lot of people who have an attribute that I know you care about, and they're in trouble. And if only you and I are needed to take a certain action to rescue these people from their pain or to give them a new opportunity, right? So I think, part of what motivates me to do this is I want to have the conversation ultimately about collective action, about things we can do. But I think that I'm, at least given the experiences I've had both in my research and in practice, I'm kind of grounded by the fact is, you and I might meet, and I might know right away that you're interested in having a conversation about how to act collectively, and so we could start right there. But most of the time I think I'm not granted that, and so I have to build that. Right? I have to try and take you from your personal narrative and say, can I find a path that brings you to, if I acted in a certain way, I could advance a value that I have, and it would also help a community. And to the extent that I see those as commensurate, let's do it. And I think that's usually how I get people, that's usually how we can get people to do it. But I think I don't have the option to say you must think of the collective first, unless I establish a trust relationship saying, I respect whatever you came into the room with. I think I have to build it from there. All right. I'm happy we're going to turn the lights and the camera off apparently, but I have another panel at 4 something, but I'm happy to stay and answer questions offline. Thank you for coming. You want to?
Thanks, Skip. And for those of you who are interested, we've got more than a dozen sessions like this in this room over the course of the next couple days.